All right. It's been a minute since we did a podcast.
Hey
We have some
guys.
stuff to catch up on. Um, but yeah, we couldn't resist doing this podcast post this massive moment, national moment with everything that's going on with the election and Trump. As of the time of this recording, we are like less than 48 hours from Trump's attempted assassination. Had I mean, it's unclear if like the market was responding to that. That seemed to me like the market was already starting to break back up, or like to climb back up before that happened. But regardless, there's likely some impact to the markets of this event, Trump getting into Bitcoin in general. What do you think?
So I think the short-term move definitely looks um like the Trump news caused a pretty aggressive continuation of an uptrend that does look like it began um on uh July 8th about and I think that my view on it is that while it's an incredible short-term move that we should definitely be paying attention to, I think that a moment like this it's like a larger conversation and like a larger potential impact on the market that we're not necessarily able to predict at this point as much as we just need to be prepared for it. Um, and I guess the way I would describe sort of how I'm thinking about this right now is, and I don't think I'm like unique in this view. I think this is pretty widespread. Um, but I think that the Trump assassination attempt is likely the most significant political event in America since the Capitol was stormed. And I guess from my point of view, the most significant event prior to that was probably 9/11. So we're talking about some like really, really big historical moments for our country, for our political system, and then by extension for our financial system and for Bitcoin and for crypto. Um, so I'm not exactly like I don't have a super strong opinion exactly how this does play out in terms of an impact on crypto. I think that um the thesis that people are putting forward right now that makes some sense to me is that the political dynamic in the United States recently has been that you know Joe Biden and the Democrats and Gary Gensler and Elizabeth Warren and that crew has sort of been, you know, putting their foot on the throat of crypto in any way that they can and regulating with a pretty heavy hand, um, to the detriment of the industry and furthermore have been really unclear with regulations. So the industry doesn't even necessarily know what to expect or how to build a long-term business. So I think that that dynamic playing out, combined with the fact that Trump has basically been becoming pro Bitcoin over the past couple of weeks as he's been brought into our community. Um, this assassination attempt, it basically looks like Trump's chances of winning have gone up, which is like a good regulatory thing for Bitcoin. I think that could be one way to interpret this move. Um, but I guess, what I was trying to express, Isabel, is that I see this as like a much larger, much longer term trend. I'm not necessarily convinced that Bitcoin has bottomed. I still think that, the pattern that we've been seeing, um, you know, going back all the way since we topped, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, since we topped um, in March, I think it's continuing to play out. And until we start breaking some of those patterns, I don't think we can really assume that the bull market is back.
What would you like to see to feel more like confident that the bull market is back?
So what I really don't like about the market right now is going back to March. We're basically getting lower highs combined with lower lows. Um, the lower high, the high was obviously, um, like just below 74,000. Then on April, let me get these exact dates here because I think they're important. Then on April 8th, we notched a slightly lower high, just around the 73,000 level. And then May 21st, another lower high around 72,000. We hit that same exact level again on June 7th. And then since then, we've taken a major move down, notched a much lower low from where we were before. The low that we had before this last move was 56,600. And then we just notched a move down to 53,000. Very close to the 52,000 level that you and I had been talking about, that a lot of people had been talking about for months, but still not quite there yet.
Pretty close though. I mean, in my mind, at the time when I saw that 53, I was like, oh, that's pretty close to that level that we've been talking about for months.
It
That
is
you
pretty close.
specifically, yeah.
It is pretty close. So so I'd like to see sort of like um, us basically breaking through some of these all-time high levels. That would be pretty important from like a market structure perspective for me.
In like past 74K.
So before we do 74, I think we need to break through obviously lower levels. And the first significant one for me would be 72. And then once we break through 72, it's like 73, and then it's all-time highs. So it's like the two levels that basically we've been notching lower highs on the way back down is what I'm looking to break. So I'm
There's
trying,
no
basically we've been creating this new market structure with these lower highs, and I'd like to see us break those.
there's no major, level between now though and 72 as far as you're concerned. Like it's kind of just like we'll just see what happens between here and there.
Not much, to be totally honest. And I think that uh, the most significant like trading action is going to be once we get back into the 70,000 level. Um, but yeah, no, I think it's like it's one of those things, and will, maybe we'll see it again in this bull market, but we've definitely seen it in past bull markets where you break like a major 10K level, and the stuff in between doesn't really matter as much.
How have ordinals, and maybe we could use like node monks as a proxy. I'm not sure how, I mean, we've talked about all the time the best way to kind of get like a general idea of like how the ordinals market broadly is doing, but how have ordinals performed relative to spot? I mean, because I know that I don't think that they dipped down I don't think that they went to all-time lows when Bitcoin went down to 53K. I think if I'm remembering correctly, I believe they actually held above their all-time lows when Bitcoin was breaking down. Um, do you
So
have
yeah,
a point of view? Yeah.
yeah, no, I mean, I think that's correct. I think, what I've seen, and it's the trend also that you and I have talked about a lot on this podcast, is, the Ordinal's assets really peaked in March, early March, and for the most part have been sort of grinding down since then. And it hasn't been like a crash as much as it's just been continuous selling.
But that you would think that that would continue as Bitcoin went down to 53K, but it didn't really.
So I guess like it would maybe be helpful to show this screen because I think the pattern of like pumping, selling off, pumping, selling off, going back to March. This is a pattern that like played out and has been playing out well before this like local bottoming pattern that we were just describing. This is a much larger trend. And I do think, to your point, um, it does lend a lot of like credence towards the argument that that Ordinal's assets have bottomed because as Bitcoin has been especially this last move notched this significantly lower low locally. These ordinals assets, as you can see, like on the right hand side of this chart, at that towards like uh, mid July and the beginning of July, like we really haven't notched a significant lower low for ordinals. Um, and then something that we're going to talk about in a little bit on this podcast is there are certain assets that actually do look like, in Bitcoin terms, that they are beginning to recover. So I think the argument for ordinals having bottomed, I mean, I think there is a decent argument to be made there. My concern and what I was expressing about the Bitcoin chart, and I just want to like complete the thought because it's not that I'm bearish right now. It's just that it's really that I'm cautious. I think that the Trump news, and we had sort of touched on this, I think long term, I think it's extremely bullish for Bitcoin, crypto, for the asset class. Um, I think short term, the concern that I have, and Isabel, you had just led a podcast about a week ago where you had some of the leaders from the mining community talking about sort of where we are in terms of like miner capitulation. And their estimate on that call was, I think it was like 40 to 50% of the way through. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And that's who's selling right now from like not only from my perspective, but from a historical perspective, after a halving, that's what you experience. You experience this process of the miners who are not, running the best business. They have to capitulate and they have to dump basically all the Bitcoin that they've accumulated onto the market as they're capitulating to cover whatever expenses they've accrued. Um, so that process is not done. It doesn't even seem like the majority of it's done, according to the people that are sort of in the know within the mining space. Um, so I think that that's like a major concern.
It would be interesting, and I should ask Nick Hansen this, like what, like if there's any data on the actual numbers of like how much Bitcoin is being thrown at the market from the mining community in particular right now versus, for instance, like Germany or Mount Gox or whatever. I think we've talked a lot about how Mount Gox is probably like overblown in terms of like its impacts, just because there's sort of been this um trading of the claims basically by these different
Yeah.
companies. But Germany, I'm less like sure about what the impacts of the German selling were. And my understanding is that that did complete this week. And that they dumped like 50,000 Bitcoin, and that's now finished.
Right. That is finished. So I think that um, like to your question, it would be super interesting to know those numbers. But I think another interesting dynamic, and I think it's part of why the miners are having an outsized impact compared to Germany, is and it's something that like you and I talk about a lot in terms of like trading, is the market builds these expectations into pricing, and it's things that they can't that the market isn't expecting or hasn't properly expected that move the market. It's not things that we necessarily know are going to happen. So the Germans, they did a good job of announcing ahead of time that they were going to do that, which allowed the market to sort of absorb that impact before they even started the selling, which is it's quite different than the miners, which we don't know, the miners aren't going to tell you how whether they're failing or not and who's failing until it's sort of over. So it's a bit of a more of an unpredictable process that I think has a bigger impact.
Right, just because it's uncertain. There's no way to
Right.
price it in advance. You have no idea which miners are like failing. We don't know what their power contracts are. We don't know what their, I mean, we just have no idea. There's no way to know how many miners are going under and with how much Bitcoin they're going under.
Right.
Um, so okay. So yeah, so it's, I mean, it is, do you think it's bullish for ordinals in general that, this, we seem to be having this sort of bottoming moment? How are you feeling about a potential correction in ordinals? Let's just say for the sake of argument that Bitcoin is correcting. Bitcoin is up quite a bit since July 8th, I think you said. Ordinals have not really moved either to the downside or to the upside, really. I mean, minor movements. Do you have a point of view about like what you, I mean, I know we don't make like price predictions or anything, but like sort of expectations about how you think ordinals will perform if we assume that Bitcoin doesn't crash back down?
Um, so I think um I think ordinals are hanging out and selling off into any price increases continuously, waiting for Bitcoin to break those significant all-time high levels like we were talking about earlier. I think the chances that ordinals runs super hard before that is low. I think more likely it's possible that fungible tokens run in the interim, and you're seeing that to some extent. Um, but maybe that's what we could talk about next. Is I think that that's more likely where you're going to see price action. Um, in the meantime, until we break those all time high levels.
And specifically Ordi. I mean, that's the only token where this is playing out so far.
Ordi, I don't know if I could confidently say it's the only token. It's definitely in terms of price action, it's the most significant. Yeah.
So Ordi is, well, like through this like rebound that Bitcoin's currently experiencing, Ordi is bounced with it.
Ordi has bounced with it in Bitcoin terms, yes, and is putting in what looks like after like a really brutal period of selling off against Bitcoin, it looks like it could possibly have put in a major bottom.
It seems like it makes sense to me. Like, I mean, we talk about sort of BRC20 v runes and this whole like debate frequently. But I mean, something that is just absolutely amazing about Ordi that no rune, has really demonstrated yet is that I think people underestimate the impacts of Ordi being traded the way that it is on centralized exchanges, right? I mean, the broader crypto community, and I see this on YouTube, I see this, everywhere outside of this tiny little like ordinals, like echo chamber Twitter vibes. Everywhere else, when you hear people talk about ordinals, they literally trade Ordi like it's a proxy for the entire ordinals ecosystem. Like I've literally heard like major like TA YouTubers refer to Ordi as the ordinals token, right? I mean, this is a common confusion, right? That I know Casey hates. But it is really important. Like people, I think outside of like our little ordinals bubble, treat Ordi like a proxy, like a proxy for the entire ecosystem and treat it as if it is a proxy for the entire ordinals ecosystem and like Bitcoin kind of de facto as well.
Yeah, I think that's right for sure. And I also think like it's the only meme coin within the Bitcoin ecosystem that's distinguished itself in any meaningful way at all. Like I think that you've got just all these runes projects right now that are sort of like going through in a lot of ways a similar process that happened on BRC20, except there's no clear winner to for value to accrue to. It's just a bunch of things that are not really that well distinguished from each other, all trying to draw market share from one another. And then on the other side, you have the BRC20 ecosystem where that process is already played out and already won.
Right. Like it's the liquidity is so spread out between all of these different runes tokens. How can any of them get like really meaningful adoption when you have all this liquidity spread thin between all these different projects? Meanwhile, it's like all the value on BRC20 has basically already accrued to Ordi. Like Ordi is like just a proxy for the entire asset, like the entire asset class.
Yeah,
Certainly
exactly.
the BRC20 asset class, right? It's just like, yeah, you're not trading like dog against some other random BRC20 like meme coin. Like it's like any random runes token against the BRC20 token. It's not totally a fair fight.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that the runes ecosystem, it's not that I'm like bearish runes long term. I think that like runes will have its day, no question about it.
I think that a big wave up in Bitcoin will probably pull one or two runes with it, but we don't know which of those it will be. Dog probably is like a reasonable bet. You know, we'll see what happens with RSIC. Like it's a little unclear what's going on with RSIC. They threw out that sort of like cryptic tweet the other day where they sort of like alluded to maybe the fact that they were working on anything when I think a lot of us had felt like a little dropped by RSIC, but maybe it was strategically advantageous for RSIC to not do anything in the depths of the correction. Like maybe they were intentionally waiting. I think there are many projects right now that are intentionally waiting to put stuff out until Bitcoin goes back up. So it's this little like chicken or the egg thing where like you don't have a ton of movement in the ecosystem because no projects want to launch when Bitcoin's down. So, I mean, there's a lot of balls in the air with runes, but to me, it feels like a foregone conclusion that of the fungible standards, you know, even regardless of Unisat, Ordi will get a lot out of a Bitcoin rebound.
And then the other thing I'd say is that like, and I think we've heard this sentiment from people like Udi in the last couple of weeks, and I agree with it. It's like Runes was supposed to be like this huge improvement on BRC20, right? And it's cool and it's great and I like it, but the reality is like as a user of this stuff every day, it hasn't improved my user experience at all, like zero. So
Minimally,
no,
right?
like
Minimally.
not really even minimally, like because there's these trade-offs where it's like, yeah, you don't have transfer inscriptions, but you do have to split your UTXOs. So it's like how much
It's
is that
different and
really that
different.
much better?
I think some of the degens out there feel like the way that Magic Eden has um, executed their front end experience of runes is potentially a little bit better than the front end experience of Unisat. Would you agree with that or not really?
I would agree with that actually. My thing is that if you want to sell runes, you have to split your UTXOs, which is not that different than transfer inscriptions, is my
And
thing.
that's still the case on Magic Eden. Like you still have to do, so I guess, but you have to split your UTXOs, but they're, and that requires a transaction, right?
So the part that Magic Eden has done, which is honestly very nice, is that when you buy your runes there, so let's say you buy 10,000, Isabel runes, you get the ability to split those UTXOs in that same transaction. So
Okay.
they offer you, they're like, okay, so you have 10,000. Do you want to split this into 10 or 5 or 2? And you can do it right then.
Right, right. You basically you do it at the moment that you receive them.
Which you
Um,
could do with transfer inscriptions for BRC20 too. You could be like, okay, like
but
you just
Unisat
bought,
hasn't done that for you,
right?
basically. Right.
Nobody's done that. That's to your point. That's the type of thing Unisat could do for you.
Right, right. Um, yeah. So yeah, so we'll see. I mean, we'll see what happens. I think, yeah, I think BRC20 is set for a little bit of like a comeback with Ordi right now. And I don't necessarily think that I think the thing that people are not necessarily always thinking about is like Ordinal's Twitter, like the active users of Ordinal's Twitter are not actually the majority of Ordinal's users. it's kind of like Bitcoin maximalists are not the majority of Bitcoin users, right? They're actually a small minority. When you think about people who are contributing to liquidity in ordinals, it's like all the people who are just like trading Ordi randomly with a bunch of altcoins on OKX, right? It's you know, all of these investors, like Chinese investors who we don't necessarily always see in English speaking ordinals Twitter, who are definitely more committed to BRC20 than runes, right? So it's like if you're only taking ordinals Twitter, you know, American Western ordinals Twitter into account when you're thinking about like where sentiment is going, you're actually missing the majority of players in the market and like what they care about and what they're doing.
True.
Um, so I think that that's something, you know, I always try to just like remind folks about like the reality of the situation. BRC20 has a ton more liquidity, way larger market cap by like a huge amount than runes as an entire as than runes as an ecosystem. So just like always good to remind people that.
Yeah. No, I mean,
Uh,
and I think our view is that runes will have its day. That day is just not now.
yeah. BRC20 is also going to put out this swap module at some point that they've been working on, and the programmability module, I'm pretty sure a spec for the programmability module is coming out soon. And that will be super interesting. I mean, we can talk a little bit about proto runes and, you know, kind of the whole programmable runes Twitter kerfuffle of the past month. But I think like that conversation really only makes sense to have in conjunction with also talking about programmable VRC20s, right? I mean, this is a broader conversation about programmable Bitcoin native assets, programmable Bitcoin native fungible assets. Um, Obviously, Casey is not going to make the core runes standard programmable. It would be completely shocking if he changed his mind on this. I don't see that happening anytime soon for like a whole slew of reasons, but you know, I guess it's not totally impossible, but it seems very, very unlikely. Um, so anything that attempts to create programmability for runes would be a fork. It would be a separate protocol. It would be a fork of runes that would be trying to create runes like functionality in a programmable way. BRC20, on the other hand, um, the BRC20 core team is currently working on implementing programmability into actual existing BRC20 core BRC20. And so those are, I think, also very, very key differences between BRC20 and Casey's runes.
Yeah.
Domo's BRC20 and Casey's runes.
I
That
also
I
think
don't
that,
know if people really understand the impacts of yet.
I was just going to add, so with Fractal, if Fractal, and it sounds like they're going to let you transfer your BRC20 and your runes assets into Fractal and then be able to trade um, within Fractal. If that's the case, I guess would that I guess my question is, would that provide any measure of programmability to runes while those runes are within Fractal?
So I am not like fully up to date on my fractal information, but my understanding is that that would require a bridge,
It
right?
it would
So it,
100%.
it's not different than like Stacks doing that or any other blockchain creating some kind of functionality like that.
The
Um,
different, I mean, you're not wrong. I don't disagree that it's not different. The difference to me is that Unisat has credibility with BRC20 traders, and I could see some like, yeah, I could see
but it's
people
still
using
not
it.
Bitcoin native. And again, I agree. I think Fractal's in a better position than like Stacks, for instance, but like Fractal is not going to be viewed the same way as like actual core BRC20 implementing programmability into its indexer.
I totally agree. I just think that Unisat holds a special place in the native Bitcoin asset trader ecosystem. There, so like for example, like when the Merlin thing came out, and this isn't like disrespect to the Merlin people, but like there was zero chance that we were going to allocate any of our like LP assets to something like that because like they were not a trusted entity that we could have any confidence in that we were ever going to get our assets back from that multi-sig, in like somebody's basement. Unisat, honestly, like I have some trust in them as like an organization. Like I think they're legitimate.
Yeah, I mean, they're working, and I'm sure the Merlin folks would also say, and we're working with best in class custodians, blah, blah, blah. But like to your point, Unisat is yeah, there's probably likely a higher level of trust, even though it is a very, very trusted, it will be a very trusted custody situation. Um, I think also, and this is a conversation that, we might have complex feelings about, but I do think that fractal adoption will also be dominated by the Asian markets. Um, Everything Unisat touches very heavily influenced by Asian markets, much more so than Western American markets. And it's unclear to me how much the Asian markets really care about things like custody. I mean, Merlin is a really good example of like, I mean, it's unclear how much Americans care about custody, let's just be real. But like, I do think that like that like the rhetoric around things like custody, my impression, my observation is like stronger amongst like this very small group of like Western KOLs, like Bitcoin maxi KOLs, and less of a thing in Asia. That's just like my observation. And this is my observation based on mostly my experiences doing BRC20 comms months ago when we were, when Unisat attempted to change its indexer, when the other indexers didn't have time to catch up. I mean, like we tried to like go this whole like Bitcoin ethics like route with the comms there. And it didn't seem like that was like the strong priority for that market, right? Like that isn't like the narrative that was that narrative wasn't as appealing to Chinese investors or Asian investors as it was to Westerners. And so, I think that Merlin's a really good example. Like, I think people didn't really care about the multi-sig thing with Merlin. Like, I think that the majority of users, they just wanted to get their yield. Like, they didn't really think about
So
the cost.
do you think they cared when there were delays getting their assets out?
I think maybe they started to care more. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
of course. I mean, everyone always hears it's like FTX, right? It's like everything. People always care when they're getting fucked over, like
No, they care when the risk is like actually rears its head.
exactly. But like in the moment, I think there's like a lot of degens who are just like, let's fucking go,
No, I agree. So, but like my thing
Yeah.
is like I don't. So I guess where I'm coming from on this is like I see the Merlin thing, and I don't disagree with really any of the points that you're making. I guess I just don't see the recipe there for like a long-term successful bridge or layer two. I just don't see it. I sort of see the possibility that Unisat could build that. Like I see
Yeah.
it, and
Yeah.
like I don't know that they will, but like the fact is like they seem like one of the most viable contenders to actually accomplish it.
They definitely have the most support, you know. I think Binance is a really good example of that, right? Like they have like the highest level investor support, I would imagine. I mean, Merlin had a bunch of investors too, but yeah, I mean, they have a different credibility profile than Merlin out the gate for sure. Even just by virtue of the fact that they're core maintainers of BRC20.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, they're like of the community at this point.
For sure, for sure. I mean, they're a maker of the community, right? I mean, they're like they're a fixture of the community. Like, and I don't think, I mean, they built the indexer. They built the BRC20 indexer with Domo, right? Like Domo invented BRC20, but Unisat built that fucking indexer. BRC20 would not exist the way that we currently understand it. It wouldn't be traded the way it currently understand it. We could understand it without Unisat. That's the reality of the situation. That I
100%.
don't think people fully understand. I don't think people fully get that. Like, yes, Domo like wrote the rules essentially, and it was like his kind of like creation, but like the tooling, all of the tooling we use for trading basically up until this point has been created by Unisat. And
And
now more recently, Best in Slot is contributing as well.
yeah, no, I think that that's an important point, and I think it's back to our conversation about why Binance is investing in Unisat. I think that's a big part of why. It's that they want an influence and they want to be involved in BRC20 at the indexer level. And, for them, that's way more valuable than getting some DEX fees.
It's incredible infra for them to get exposure to, even if they don't influence it, right? Like that's like a major piece of infra to have exposure to as an investor.
Totally.
It makes sense. Like if I'm Binance, that just makes sense.
Totally. No,
Um,
I 100% agree. And I think it's yeah, it's hard to deny Unisat's like role at this point.
yep. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that is like,
Maybe, yeah, if you want to cover the proto runes thing, and maybe we're good.
I mean, proto runes. So, I mean, I think we did like a good intro about just, I'll call it like programmability as a concept for BRC20 and runes. And again, for anyone who's watching who's confused about what that means, that basically means the ability, what we're saying when we talk about programmability is attaching a virtual machine, like a Turing complete computer essentially, to runes and or BRC20 at the indexer level, meaning you don't need to bridge to another chain. You don't need to like have some sort of trusted custody solution. This computation is just happening at the indexer level. So you can effectively execute things like smart contracts, for instance, in BRC20 or runes. That's what, just for anyone who's like confused about what that word means, because I do think it can be confusing for folks. Which would be huge, right? I mean, it would absolutely be game changing. Again, pretty clear that Casey is not going to introduce this to actual runes. BRC20, it looks like, is going to introduce this, which is a major distinction between Casey's runes and Domo's BRC20, that I don't think people really understand or are ready for, or like that we can possibly understand the implications of. And I think, yeah, but there are teams that are working on forks of runes that include a VM, that include this sort of programmability functionality into the indexer of runes, but it is a fork. It is not Casey's runes. It is a new type of runes that would have programmable functionality. And I think there are a few teams working on this, but the most notable right now is, so the CTO of Oil Dynamics, which is, they do a bunch of stuff. I mean, they're building a ton of different infra stuff in Bitcoin, mostly developer tooling. They also have a wallet that I think primarily, up to this point has been serving kind of as a demo for some of the tooling that they're building. But I'm not sure that I don't think the wallet is publicly available yet, but maybe ideally in the next couple months. But regardless, they have a pretty interesting indexer product that is effectively designed for developers to be able to build their own meta protocols. And it makes it really easy to essentially create custom indexers that you can build your own meta protocol with your own rule set based on these indexers, and for runes, BRC20, et cetera. And as a demo of this, essentially, their CTO, Flex, who is just an incredibly great guy. Like I just adore him. I just think he's just amazing. He's just an amazing human. Is put out a spec for something called proto runes, which is essentially programmable runes that uses WASM, not EVM, which is likely what the BRC20 core team will be using. So it will have different interoperability prospects. That's something also to note about proto runes versus BRC20. But it's really interesting, like it's really awesome that this is being built. Like I think this is something that we should be encouraging as a community of like people being creative and building interesting things that develop the ecosystem. Yeah. And I think it's awesome that they're like, attempting to build something like this. It'll be really interesting to see what happens when that actually goes live, which I think is happening sooner rather than later. I'm not totally sure, but like I know that that's something that in theory, the first proto rune should be out pretty soon. And I hope I'm not totally like doxing this situation, but I'll just say this. Once this is out, it opens the doorway for things like stables on BRC on proto runes. anything you can do with DeFi, basically, you can do on proto runes. None of which you can do with regular runes. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.